I found a hidden door in my apartment. What was inside shocked me. I had lived in my apartment for almost a year before I found the door. It was a small one-bedroom unit in an old brownstone building, the kind with creaky wooden floors and walls that seemed to whisper at night. But it was cheap, and in the city, that was all that mattered. One evening, as I was rearranging my furniture, I moved my bookshelf slightly to the left. That's when I saw it. A faint outline of a door on the wall, its edges barely visible. My heart started racing. How had I never noticed this before? I pressed my fingers against the wall, searching for a handle or a seam. A small, almost imperceptible groove ran along the edge. My curiosity got the better of me. With a deep breath, I pushed. The door creaked open. A narrow, dimly lit passage stretched into darkness. A cold draft rushed out, sending a chill down my spine. Every rational part of me screamed to close the door and forget I had ever found it. But I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The passageway was lined with old, peeling wallpaper, the kind you'd see in a Victorian-era home. The air smelled of dust and something else. Something rotten. My footsteps echoed as I stepped inside. At the end of the hallway was a small room. Inside, I found something that made my blood turn to ice. A single wooden chair sat in the center, surrounded by dozens of old photographs scattered across the floor. My hands trembled as I picked one up. It was a picture of my apartment. But the furniture was different. Antique-looking. The date in the corner read 1978. I grabbed another photo. This one showed a man sitting on the same chair in the room. His face was blurred, as if it had been intentionally smudged. My stomach tightened. I shuffled through more photos. Each one showed the same thing. The same man, the same chair, the same room. But in the last one, the man was staring directly at the camera. A sound behind me made me freeze. A slow, deliberate creak. I spun around. The door I had entered through was closing, on its own. My flashlight flickered. The air felt thick, suffocating. And then I heard it. A whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." I ran. I don't remember how I got out, but I stumbled back into my apartment, slammed the hidden door shut, and shoved the bookshelf back in place. My hands were shaking. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely think. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called my landlord, pretending I had questions about the building's history. He chuckled. "Oh, you found it, huh? Every tenant does eventually. But don't worry. As long as you don't go back in, you'll be fine." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. That was 6 months ago. I never touched that bookshelf again. But sometimes, late at night, I hear creaking sounds coming from behind it. And sometimes, I hear whispers. I tried to ignore it. I really did. For weeks, I avoided the bookshelf, telling myself it was just my imagination. Old buildings made noises. Wood creaked. Pipes groaned. That was all. But the whispers, they got worse. At first, they were faint, like a distant radio signal just beyond hearing. But over time, they became clearer. Some nights, I swore I heard my own name. And then, one night, I woke up to the sound of breathing. Not my own. It was coming from behind the bookshelf. Slow, ragged, deliberate. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The air in my apartment was heavy, suffocating. I turned on my bedside lamp, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the room was empty. The breathing continued. I knew I had to check. If I didn't, I would lose my mind. Slowly, I got out of bed and crept toward the bookshelf. My hands trembled as I reached for it. With a deep breath, I pushed it aside. The hidden door was open. Not just open, wide open. My phone's flashlight barely pierced the darkness beyond. My instinct screamed at me to shut the door and leave it alone. But something else, some terrible, twisted curiosity, pulled me forward. I stepped inside. The room at the end of the hallway was just as I'd left it. The old chair, the scattered photographs. But there was something new. A mirror stood against the far wall. It hadn't been there before. The frame was ornate, covered in strange, unreadable symbols. The glass was cracked down the middle, but I could still see my reflection. Except, it wasn't quite right. My reflection wasn't moving the way it should. It was delayed, like a lagging video. Then, slowly, it smiled. I hadn't smiled. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The reflection lifted a hand and pointed at something behind me. I turned around. The chair was no longer empty. A figure sat there. I couldn't see its face. Just the outline of a man, hunched forward, hands resting on his knees. A low, guttural whisper filled the room. A whisper, "You're not supposed to be here." The lights on my phone flickered. The walls seemed to close in. I turned and ran, heart slamming against my ribs. The hallway stretched longer than before, like it was trying to trap me. The door at the end was closing, slowly, like a mouth shutting tight. I barely made it through. I shoved the bookshelf back into place and pressed my back against it, gasping for air. Then, silence. I didn't sleep that night. Or the next. I started keeping the lights on. I played loud music to drown out the whispers. I avoided the bookshelf like it was a disease. But the whispers haven't stopped. And last night, when I passed by the mirror in my bedroom, I noticed something. My reflection. It wasn't lagging anymore. It was ahead of me. I didn't move. I stared at the mirror, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. My reflection stood still, watching me. But I hadn't stopped moving yet. I had taken another step forward. How was that possible? Slowly, I raised my hand. My reflection did the same. But just before our hands aligned, it twitched. A flicker of movement that wasn't mine. And then, it grinned. Not a normal grin. Not my grin. The corners of its mouth stretched too far, its lips curling upward like something out of a nightmare. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. The lights in my apartment flickered. A soft creaking noise filled the room. I spun toward the bookshelf. The hidden door was open again. My stomach twisted into knots. I knew I hadn't touched it. I knew I had shoved the bookshelf firmly back in place. And yet, the dark hallway yawned open like a hungry maw, waiting for me to step inside. Then, the whispers started again. But this time, they weren't just sounds in the distance. They were right behind me. My body locked up in terror. I turned my head ever so slightly toward the mirror. My reflection was still grinning, but it wasn't alone anymore. A shadow loomed behind it. A dark, shifting figure with hollow, empty eyes. It pressed long, bony fingers against the glass, as if trying to push through. The apartment grew colder. My breath fogged in front of me. I couldn't stay here. I grabbed my coat, my phone, and my keys and bolted for the door. My heart was hammering as I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking too much to turn it properly. And then, the lights went out. The entire apartment was swallowed by darkness. I stood there, frozen, my fingers still gripping the doorknob. The whispers grew louder. The air felt thick, suffocating. Then, from the hidden room, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming toward me. I yanked the door open and ran. I didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for breath in the cold night air. The streetlights above buzzed softly, their glow a sharp contrast to the oppressive darkness inside my apartment. I stood there for a long time, trying to calm the wild pounding in my chest. And then, slowly, I looked up at my apartment window. The light was on, but I had just left. I had turned off all the lights. And worse, there was someone standing in the window, watching me. It was me. But I wasn't smiling anymore. I was waving, and behind my reflection, the shadow loomed. The last thing I saw before I turned and ran into the night. Was my reflection letting it in? I don't remember how long I ran. The streets blurred around me as I pushed my legs to move faster, but the feeling of being watched never left. My pulse pounded in my ears, each beat a reminder that whatever was inside my apartment, it wasn't finished with me. Eventually, I stopped. I found myself in the park a few blocks away, breathing heavily, staring up at the sky as the chill of early morning crept into my skin. The lights in the park flickered in the darkness, casting long, strange shadows on the sidewalk. I couldn't think straight. My mind was in a whirlpool of terror and confusion. Why was there another version of me? How could it be there? What had I uncovered in that hidden room? I knew I couldn't go back. But even as I thought it, something inside me wanted to go back. A strange compulsion tugged at me, urging me to face whatever was behind that door, to understand it, to stop running. And so, like a puppet on a string, I found myself walking back toward my apartment. The city was eerily quiet as I approached the brownstone. It felt like the world itself was holding its breath. I stopped at the door. My hand hovered over the handle. The night air felt thick and heavy with something wrong. But there was no turning back now. I pushed the door open, and immediately I felt the change. The moment I stepped inside, I knew the apartment wasn't the same. The walls seemed to press in on me, the air thicker, heavier, colder. And in the silence, I heard it, the faint, rhythmic sound of breathing again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from inside the apartment. I froze. I didn't want to look, but I had to. Slowly, I turned toward the living room. There, sitting on my couch, was a figure. The same man I had seen in the photos, the one whose face was always blurred. But now, he wasn't blurred. His features were sharp. His eyes, black as pitch, locked onto mine with a gaze that pierced through me like a blade. He smiled. "You came back," he said, his voice smooth and cold, like ice sliding across glass. I couldn't speak. My throat was dry, every inch of me screaming to turn and run, but my legs were frozen. "I warned you," he continued, his smile widening. A chill ran down my spine as the room seemed to grow colder still. The air around me felt thick, like it was pressing in, suffocating me. I could feel the shadows creeping in from the corners of the room, stretching toward me like tendrils, reaching, pulling me in. And then I heard a voice. A soft whisper in my ear, one I recognized immediately. "It's too late." It was my own voice. But it wasn't me. I turned around. Standing in the doorway of the hidden room was my reflection. The same reflection I had seen in the mirror, the one that was ahead of me, smiling. It wasn't just smiling anymore. It was laughing. The sound was maddening, hollow, as though it came from a place where laughter was no longer human. And then it stepped forward. As it moved, the shadows seemed to melt into it. The figure began to grow, stretching and warping in the dim light, until it became something unrecognizable. Its eyes, black and empty, focused on me, its lips curling into a cruel grin. I couldn't breathe. "You've let it out," it said, its voice now a low, guttural growl. "And now it's here to stay." The room spun. I stumbled back, my feet hitting the edge of the coffee table. My head collided with the floor, sending shockwaves of pain through my skull. And as I lay there, vision swimming, I saw the door to the hidden room begin to close. But not on its own. It was closing behind me. I knew what I had to do. The figure, my reflection, was now standing directly above me, its shadow swallowing me whole. I had only one chance. With all the strength I had left, I reached for my phone. I barely managed to unlock it, but I did. My fingers were slick with sweat as I tapped the screen, pulling up my landlord's contact. It was the only thing I could think of. I needed answers. With my heart in my throat, I hit send. And waited. As the phone rang, I heard something shift in the room. The figure, my reflection, was watching me with cold, dead eyes. The shadows seemed to bend toward me, pulling me closer. The phone clicked, and my landlord's voice came through, his tone far too calm. "You should have listened. You were never meant to find that door." And then a whisper. "Now it's yours. Forever." The line went dead. I looked up. The figure was gone, but the door was open, and I was standing on the other side of it. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, the phone still clutched in my hand, the eerie silence of the apartment pressing in from all sides. The door to the hidden room loomed before me, dark and inviting. I didn't want to step inside. I didn't want to go back. But somehow the door seemed to pull at me, a magnetic force that I couldn't resist. It was as if something on the other side was calling to me, a pull deeper than my fear. I could hear faint whispers again, softer this time, but they were unmistakable. They wrapped around me like fingers, urging me forward. My reflection's laughter still echoed in my head. "Now it's yours. Forever." The words were like a curse, heavy and suffocating, but also inviting. I took a shaky step forward, my legs unwilling to obey. Another step. And then, before I even knew what I was doing, I crossed the threshold into the hidden room. The moment I stepped inside, the world changed. The walls stretched impossibly tall, their surface slick with shadows. The air was thick with cold, like a tomb. The floor beneath me groaned with each step I took, as though the very building was alive and aware. The man was there. He hadn't moved from the center of the room, sitting in the same chair, but now he looked different. His form was more defined, his features sharper, his eyes blacker than before, sucking in all light. He spoke, his voice rasping like dry leaves in a windstorm. "Welcome home." A shiver ran down my spine. I stumbled back, but the door behind me slammed shut with an ear-splitting crack. The shadows in the room began to writhe. The whispers grew louder, louder still until they were a deafening roar, swirling around me like a storm. I covered my ears, but the sound was inside my head now, impossibly close. And then, I saw it. In the far corner of the room, a mirror stood, its surface black as pitch, reflecting nothing but darkness. But as I approached it, the reflection shifted. It wasn't me. It was the figure, my reflection. And behind it was something else. Something much worse. The mirror seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen hand, and out from the depths I saw another door. A door that wasn't there before. A door that seemed to lead to somewhere even darker. "Do you understand now?" the man asked, his voice low and gravelly. His black eyes never left me. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The whispers had become unbearable, clawing at my mind, each word seeping into my thoughts like poison. I couldn't take it any longer. I turned and ran, but my legs didn't move the way they should. I couldn't feel the floor beneath me, as if I was floating, suspended between two worlds. My body felt weightless, as if the room was no longer solid. I crashed into the mirror. Or was it the door? The world shattered around me. A million fragments of glass and shadow exploded into the air. And as the pieces rained down, I heard the man's voice again, closer this time, right behind me. "You never left. You never will." And then I woke up. But something was wrong. The apartment was the same. My room, the same. The bed, the same. But I wasn't alone. The mirror on the wall was no longer cracked. And in its reflection, I saw myself, sitting on the bed, smiling. But it wasn't my smile. It was the one that had greeted me in the room behind the door. The one that wasn't mine. And in the corner of the reflection, behind me, the shadow was there, waiting. I could feel it. I could feel it. And I knew then, the door had never really closed. The door was always here, inside me. I couldn't breathe. The reflection in the mirror was still grinning, and I knew I knew that it wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was a part of me, a part of something else. Something I had brought with me when I first stepped through that hidden door. The shadow behind me in the mirror was moving, creeping, inching closer to me with each passing second. I turned around quickly, but the room was empty. The apartment unchanged. But the mirror, it didn't lie. I tried to look away, but my eyes wouldn't leave the glass. The smile on my reflection twisted, widening unnaturally, as if it was stretching to consume my face entirely. Its eyes, my eyes, were no longer black, but an endless, hollow void. And then it spoke. "You can't escape me." The voice wasn't mine. It was something darker, older, hungry. I stumbled backward, my feet tangling in the sheets. But there was nowhere to go. The mirror was everywhere. It was in my room. It was in my mind. I closed my eyes, pressing my hands against my ears, trying to block out the sound of that voice, the whispers that slithered from every corner of my apartment, crawling into my brain. But it didn't help. The room began to spin, the walls tilting and warping, stretching like rubber. I felt weightless, floating as if the air itself was dissolving beneath me. "You wanted to understand, didn't you?" The voice echoed again, like 1,000 whispers wrapping around my thoughts. "Now you do. Now you're mine." I opened my eyes. The reflection was still there. But this time, it was walking toward me. I blinked, and in that instant, I saw something that made my blood freeze. I wasn't alone. Behind my reflection, standing in the darkness, was another figure. A tall, shapeless shadow, its features shifting like smoke. It wasn't human. It was something else. Something that didn't belong in this world. My reflection, still smiling, raised its hand and touched the glass. And I felt a sharp jolt in my chest as if I had been physically struck. It wasn't just the mirror anymore. The room was shifting, the air bending, warping like it was being pulled into the mirror itself. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was being drawn in, slowly, irresistibly. Every inch of my body felt heavy, as if the air itself was pressing me down, trying to sink me into the glass. I heard the man's voice again, but this time it wasn't just a voice. It was all around me. "You've opened the door, but you've never truly left. You'll never leave. We are here. You are here." The last thing I saw was the reflection reaching through the glass. No longer a reflection. It was real, and it was coming for me. And then everything went black. I woke up again. The mirror was gone. My room was quiet. I was lying in my bed, sweat clinging to my skin, my heart racing in my chest. But something felt wrong. I blinked, the morning light shining through the blinds. I could feel the soft, steady rhythm of my pulse. But there was a heaviness in the air, the weight of something, watching. I looked around the room. The mirror had disappeared. There were no shadows in the corners, no whispers in the air. It was just quiet. But then I noticed something. On my dresser, something was out of place. A small, old photograph. I hadn't seen it before. I picked it up. It was a picture of my apartment taken years ago. But in the corner, there was something I couldn't ignore. A door. A hidden door. It had been in the wall before I ever even moved in. And in the doorway, standing behind it, was my reflection, smiling. "You'll never escape," it whispered. "This is home." And as the photograph crumbled in my fingers, I realized the truth. I was never meant to leave. The door, the mirror, the reflection, they were waiting for me to return. And now, I was a part of it. Forever. I stood there, holding the crumpled photograph in my trembling hands, the weight of its truth sinking deep into my chest. The whispers started again, soft at first, but then they grew louder, like distant voices carried on the wind, calling me, beckoning me. I felt the cold air rush into the room, chilling me to the bone. But it wasn't just the wind. It was the presence of something else. Something old. Something hungry. I turned, suddenly aware of a growing shift in the room. The shadows seemed to stretch and writhe, pooling in the corners like ink bleeding across paper. It was as if the apartment itself was alive. I rushed toward the door, my heart pounding in my ears, my fingers fumbling with the doorknob. But when I tried to turn it, the door wouldn't open. I pulled harder, my breath shallow, my mind spiraling with panic. I had to get out. I had to leave. But the whispers, they were louder now, closing in. I turned around, and that's when I saw it. The mirror. It wasn't the same one that had been there before. This one was larger, with a thick, gold-framed edge, standing proudly against the far wall. And in the reflection, it wasn't me. I wasn't the one standing there. It was a figure, distant and blurry at first, but slowly becoming clearer. It was a woman. Her face, pale and cold, seemed to flicker in and out of focus. Her eyes were dark, empty, but I could feel them watching me, staring straight into my soul. And then, she smiled. The same smile. The smile that wasn't mine. Suddenly, the room felt like it was spinning. The walls tilted and I staggered, trying to stay upright. The whispers filled my head, becoming a roar, a maddening chorus of voices that didn't belong to anyone I knew. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to run, but my legs felt heavy, like they were moving through thick, sticky fog. The woman in the mirror reached out. Her hand pressed against the glass as if to pull me closer. And then, the reflection stretched. Her fingers elongated through the glass. I screamed in silence as her hand emerged fully, its long, bony fingers wrapping around my wrist. I fought to break free, but it was no use. Her grip was like iron, pulling me closer, drawing me toward the mirror. And in the final, desperate moments before I disappeared into the darkness, I heard her voice. Low and cold, echoing in the chamber of my mind. You should have never come back. Everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, I was standing in the same room, my apartment. But everything was wrong. The light that streamed through the window was dim, faded like it belonged to a different time. The walls, cracked and broken, seemed to bend. And the air? It was thick, stagnant, like no one had breathed it for years. I looked around, trying to find any sign of normalcy. But there was nothing. No sound. No movement. And then I saw it. The photograph, still clutched tightly in my hand. But now the image had changed. The hidden door was gone, replaced by a new door, one that hadn't been there before. A door that looked too familiar. I had never opened it. But I knew what it was. I had seen it. I had felt it. The door that led to nowhere. As I walked toward it, my reflection didn't follow. It was still trapped behind the glass, where it had always been. But in the reflection, there was no one standing there anymore. Only the shadow. And in the corner, a single word appeared, written in dark, dripping ink. Welcome home.